We are joined now by Max Abrahms, an expert in counterterrorism and the author of Rules for Rebels, The Science of Victory in Militant History. Max, is the world, in fact, a safer place since the September 11th attacks?
Sure. I mean, the terrorism threat around the world is not the same in one country in comparison to another. We often talk about the international terrorism threat, but of course there's very wide variation depending on where you're living. For example, if we're talking about Syria, as you were in the run-up to this, or if you're talking about Yemen or Afghanistan or Nigeria, then the terrorism threat is probably higher. For most Americans, though, I would say that the terrorism threat is lower if we're most worried about a mass casualty, highly sophisticated operation like the kind that happened on 9/11, because there are so many more countermeasures in place. The government is looking for these kinds of relationships. There aren't training grounds that are underneath U.S. noses where large-scale plots are being hatched against the United States. And so in that sense, Americans might be safer.
Well,
However,
let me interrupt you because I've got a lot of questions that I got to get to in a limited amount of time. As you mentioned, September 11th, highly sophisticated. We're talking about 19 hijackers, 4 airplanes. But today, Max, as you're very well aware, a single suspect can blow up a vehicle. We've seen it time after time. So the new threat of terrorism perhaps may not be something so well coordinated and sophisticated, but something as simple as a car bomb.
That's exactly right. Terrorists are strategic actors, and so they're constantly adjusting to government countermeasures. And as counterterrorism has become more intense, especially U.S.-led operations, we're seeing fewer, cohesive networks and more lone wolf type, one-off terrorist attacks. And one of their main modes of operations are the vehicular attacks. And so more and more Western countries are worried about lone wolf attacks, particularly ones that use a vehicle.
Yeah, vehicles ramming into large crowds of people. 15 of the 19 hijackers behind the worst terror act on American soil were from Saudi Arabia. The rest were from Egypt, Lebanon, and the United Arab Emirates. And none of these countries are on President Trump's travel ban. So meaning if this ban had been in effect in 2001, it would not have prevented the September 11th attacks.
Yeah, that's right. Although people are talking a lot about essentially the jihadist threat because it's 9/11, the reality is that within Washington, D.C., I do not regard the jihadist threat, the Al-Qaeda guys, their affiliated groups, ISIS, I do not view those guys as the foremost threat within Washington, D.C. The bigger threat, it seems to me, in the opinion of most policy analysts in D.C., is Iran. And so actually, the United States has been cozying up with countries like Saudi Arabia, even though they have closer historic ties to the jihadists, in order to counterbalance the Iranian threat. And so it's been interesting to watch the evolution of U.S. threat perceptions post 9/11.
Yeah, and it's important to point out Iran had nothing to do with those September 11th attacks. Max Abrahms, thank you so much.